Hi, I'm Mr.Zooiii, and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to talk about a nation that you might not have heard of, but whose story is a fascinating and, dare I say, tragic tale of ambition, revolution, and eventual collapse. I'm talking about Gran Colombia, or Greater Colombia. For a brief shining moment from 1819 to 1831, this republic united a vast swathe of northern South America. What we now know as Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Panama, and parts of Peru and Brazil, it was an audacious project, a grand experiment in post-colonial nation-building. The visionary, the architect, the dreamer behind this massive state was none other than Simón Bolívar, El Libertador, the man who had led the charge to throw off the yoke of Spanish rule. Bolívar didn't just want independence. He envisioned a powerful, unified republic that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the great powers of Europe and North America. He saw Greater Colombia as the cornerstone of a united Hispanic America, a beacon of liberty and strength. But as we know from history, grand visions often collide with messy realities. So what happened? How did this dream, forged in the fires of revolution, crumble into dust in just over a decade? It wasn't one single thing, but a perfect storm of compounding problems. In this video, we're going to break down the 7 main reasons why Greater Colombia collapsed, from impassable mountains and political infighting to a crisis of identity that the new nation could never quite overcome. It's a story about how difficult it is to build something new, and how sometimes even the noblest of dreams can be torn apart by the very people they are meant to unite. So let's start with the most fundamental problem, something you can't just fix with a decree or a constitution geography. I mean, just look at a topographical map of this region. Greater Colombia was an absolute monster of a territory. You have the towering Andes Mountains, a massive, rugged spine running right through the heart of the country, splitting it into isolated valleys and plateaus. Then you have the dense, nearly impenetrable Amazon rainforest to the south and east, and swampy, disease-ridden coastal lowlands. This wasn't just a big country, it was a country actively trying to keep its own people apart. Think about what that means in the early 19th century. There are no highways, no railways, no telegraphs. Communication between the capital in Bogotá and other major centers like Caracas or Quito was agonizingly slow and dangerous. A journey that takes a few hours by plane today could take weeks or even months by mule over treacherous mountain passes. This physical isolation bred regionalism. People in Venezuela felt Venezuelan, not Gran Colombian. People in Quito felt, well, like they were from Quito. The central government in Bogotá was a distant, abstract concept, while the local mountains, rivers, and leaders were immediate, tangible realities. Unity is hard to build when you can't even visit your neighbors. Which brings us to our second major issue, a deep, philosophical, and intensely personal political divide. At the center of this conflict were 2 competing visions for the new republic. On one side, you had Simón Bolívar and his supporters, the centralists. Having witnessed the chaos and disunity of the early independence movements, Bolívar was convinced that only a strong, centralized government with power concentrated in the capital could hold the vast and diverse nation together. He feared that a loose federation would quickly devolve into anarchy and infighting, making the republic vulnerable to foreign powers and internal collapse. To him, centralization meant survival. Opposing him were the federalists, led by figures like Francisco de Paula Santander in New Granada and José Antonio Páez in Venezuela. These leaders and the regions they represented were deeply suspicious of a powerful central authority. They had just fought a war to get rid of a distant king in Spain. They weren't exactly thrilled about the idea of replacing him with a distant president in Bogotá. They argued for a federal system, one that granted significant autonomy to the individual states or departments. They wanted to maintain their local power, control their own economies, and manage their own affairs, seeing federalism as the true expression of liberty. This wasn't just a political debate, it was a fundamental clash over the very nature of the new state. As is so often the case in history, political squabbles were fueled by economic grievances. The decade-long wars for independence had absolutely shattered the region's economy. Mines were abandoned, farms were destroyed, and a huge portion of the male workforce had been killed or was still in the army. The new republic was born into a state of near bankruptcy, saddled with enormous debts to foreign lenders, mostly British, who had financed the war effort. To pay these debts and fund the new government and its massive army, Bogotá had to raise revenue, and that meant taxes. And nobody likes taxes, especially when you feel like you aren't getting anything in return. The different regions of Greater Colombia had very different economies. Venezuela's wealth was in agriculture, especially cacao and coffee, and its powerful landowners resented sending their tax money to a government in Bogotá. Ecuador had a more textile-based, artisanal economy. The mining regions of New Granada had their own distinct interests. The central government's attempts to create a unified economic policy often felt to these regions like it favored one group over another. Resentment festered over the distribution of resources and the tax burden, adding a thick layer of economic fuel to the fires of political and regional discontent. In the early days, the sheer force of Simón Bolívar's personality and his immense prestige as El Libertador were the glue holding Greater Colombia together. He was the one figure everyone could rally around. But as the nation's problems mounted, that glue began to fail. Frustrated by constant political infighting and the drift towards anarchy, Bolívar's political style grew more authoritarian. In 1828, after surviving a brutal assassination attempt in Bogotá, the September Conspiracy, he assumed dictatorial powers, dissolving Congress and ruling by decree. This move backfired spectacularly. For many, including his former allies like Santander, this was the ultimate betrayal. The liberator now looked like a tyrant, the very thing they had fought the Spanish to overthrow. His health was failing, worn down by years of campaigning and the immense stress of governing. His political capital was exhausted. Realizing his dream was collapsing and that his presence was now a source of conflict, Bolívar resigned from the presidency in early 1830. His departure created a massive power vacuum that no one else could fill. The one man who might have held it all together was gone, leaving the republic adrift and leaderless. With Bolívar's authority crumbling and then gone completely, the regional tensions that had been simmering for years finally boiled over. The centrifugal forces pulling the republic apart became unstoppable. The first major break came from Venezuela, which had always been the most restive and federalist-minded part of the Union. In late 1829, under the leadership of the powerful Caudillo José Antonio Páez, a Congress in Valencia declared Venezuela's separation from Greater Colombia. They weren't asking for permission, they were stating a fact. Páez, a hero of the independence wars, became the leader of a newly sovereign Venezuela. This act opened the floodgates. Seeing Venezuela successfully secede without consequence, other regions followed suit. In May 1830, the Department of the South, centered on Quito, declared its own independence, forming the nation of Ecuador under the leadership of Juan José Flores. The central government in Bogotá was powerless to stop it. What followed was a period of intense turmoil and localized civil wars as different factions and regions vied for control. The very thing Bolívar had feared, anarchy and fragmentation, was now a reality. The Grand Republic was not just collapsing, it was being actively dismantled by its own constituent parts. And this brings us to a more intangible, but perhaps the most profound reason for the collapse. Greater Colombia never developed a true, unified national identity. Think about it. What did a llanero cowboy from the Venezuelan plains, a merchant in the port city of Guayaquil, an artisan in Quito, and a bureaucrat in Bogotá really have in common? Yes, they spoke Spanish, and yes, they had all been part of the Spanish Empire, but freeing themselves from Spain was one thing. Forging a new, cohesive identity as Gran Colombians was another challenge entirely. Their loyalties remained fiercely local and regional. They were Venezuelans, New Grenadians, and Ecuadorians first and foremost. The concept of Greater Colombia was an intellectual and political project imposed from the top down by an elite group of revolutionaries. It never truly seeped into the hearts and minds of the general population. There was no shared national story beyond the recent war, no common symbols that resonated equally in all regions, no deep-seated sense of a common destiny. Without that shared identity, that feeling of we-ness, there was nothing to counteract the powerful pull of regional self-interest when times got tough. The nation simply didn't feel like a nation. So in the end, we're left with Bolívar's dream itself. And it was, in many ways, a dream ahead of its time. Bolívar was a visionary, a man who saw the bigger picture. He understood that the newly independent states of South America would be weak and vulnerable if they remained small, divided, and quarreling amongst themselves. He envisioned a powerful, united bloc that could command respect on the world stage, protect its hard-won independence, and foster prosperity. It was a noble, and in many ways a prescient vision. He foresaw the dangers of fragmentation that would plague Latin America for the next century. But a vision, no matter how brilliant, cannot succeed if the conditions aren't right, and in the 1820s they simply weren't. The other leaders of the independence movement, men like Santander and Páez, were more pragmatic, more provincial, and ultimately more interested in securing their own power in their own home regions than in sacrificing for a grand, abstract continental project. They were caudillos, regional strongmen, and their power base was local. Bolívar's dream of unity clashed directly with their reality of self-interest. They paid lip service to the liberators' ideals, but when it came down to it, they chose to rule their own smaller nations rather than be second in command of a larger one. Bolívar's dream was for a future that hadn't arrived yet. So there you have it. The collapse of Greater Colombia was not a simple event, but a complex tapestry of failure. The insurmountable geography created deep-seated regionalism that the nation's political structure could never overcome. The ideological battle between a strong central government and regional autonomy created a permanent state of political warfare. The post-war economic devastation and unequal burdens bred resentment and instability, while the lack of a shared national identity meant there was no popular will to hold the union together when it started to crack. It was a cascade of failures, each one compounding the last. At the center of it all was Simón Bolívar, a tragic hero in the classical sense. His grand ambition was to build a nation worthy of the sacrifice it took to win its freedom. He dreamed of a united, powerful, and enlightened republic, but he was ultimately defeated by the very forces he had unleashed. His dream was undone by impassable mountains, local loyalties, the self-interest of his lieutenants, and the sheer difficulty of creating a nation from scratch. The story of Greater Colombia is a powerful and, I think, a poignant reminder that a revolution doesn't end when the fighting stops. That's when the even harder work of building a nation truly begins. What do you think? Could Greater Colombia have survived? What's the most important lesson we can learn from its failure? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.